flock to support that narrative like Wendy Nelson did. I'm sorry that I'm characterizing that story that way. Where she said that back in January 2020, all of a sudden, she turns around and all their speaking engagements at all of these big arenas and facilities around the country and around the world, just sort of, I don't know, taking an eraser and wiped them off the whiteboard. And she's going, what happened to all these? And he says, oh, I don't know. I just figured we didn't need to really do those. And then she looks at the audience and says, there's a prophet in the land. I just want you to know that.
RFM is not exaggerating either. If you listen to Wendy Nelson give that talk, that's literally what she's doing. Is she's saying that Russell Nelson got a revelation that there'd be no traveling going on, and instead of warning the church, preparing the church, he just canceled some event holds on venues. And so, yeah, I would say it's a ridiculous story, but it shows how, to be fair though, Wendy Nelson has a few of those stories where she tends to exaggerate what Russell Nelson is doing, and we should cover that maybe in the future. But yeah, it just shows how we can backdate these stories to fit perfectly with events that happened recently in order to promote faith among the church, even though the actual details of the stories do not seem to line up, or in that case, there's absolutely no reason to think that they're true. So,
another example of that is when Wendy Nelson too, or I should say Sherry Dew, said in a recent talk about prophesying around corners that, what was it? It was like 1990, was it 1998? What was the big problem that we had? It was 2008, right? That was the economy and went down the crapper. So in 2008, 10 years, see, that's what she said, 10 years before that, she was listening in conference and heard the prophet at the time, President Hinckley, talk about putting our houses in order and getting out of debt. So she did that. She paid off her mortgage. She has no dependents because no kids, right? And no spouse, so she doesn't have the kind of responsibilities, financial responsibilities that those incur. But 10 years later, when everything went down, she was driving home thinking how bad things were. But then she realized, oh my gosh, things are pretty good for me because I don't owe any debt because I followed that prophet's voice, which was actually in the priesthood session that she couldn't even listen to, at least not lawfully at the time. She could probably read it when it came out in the ensign. But yes, this is what she does. And so that's prophecy. That's a prophet in the land. We are so starved in the LDS church for legitimate prophecy that we will grab these scraps that fall from the table and we'll look at them and pretend that there's something amazing, that they're a 5-course meal, and present them that way.
Good financial advice. That's all it was.
Yes, which has never been repeated, which has never been said in conference other than in 2008 by President Hinckley.
I remember all growing up, counsel to stay out of debt from the 80s on. That's been just, and it's just, who doesn't say that? Like Dr. Phil, Oprah, like Dave Ramsey. These are American references, Nemo. I apologize for that. But
I think the last series of about, 8 U.S. presidents haven't said that.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, I always got to make it political. All right, so you've got the next slide, Mike, which says that even Nelson admits that he had no idea that COVID was coming.
And so, at the April 2020 General Conference, Russell Nelson said, "Little did I know, when I promised you at the October 2019 General Conference that this April conference would be memorable and unforgettable, that speaking to a visible congregation of fewer than 10 people would make this conference so memorable and unforgettable for me." And so, it's just, to be clear, this is not a backdated prophecy in that it wasn't recorded as such, but one of the points that RFM made in this podcast, which I thought was really interesting, was if we did not have contemporary records of what Russell Nelson said in 2019 and 2020, if you went 10 years from now, everybody in the church would be writing about how Russell Nelson correctly predicted COVID because we wouldn't be able to look at video and see what he was saying. And so this is kind of how us as believing members were able to reshape what he said into fulfilling or to creating a prophecy that came true through COVID. Whereas when you look at the data, obviously it doesn't support that. But it does show when you look back into the early church where there aren't as many records, or even into the Bible, you can see how these stories can be created kind of out of either nothing or out of very vague words that then all of a sudden are solidified as these grand prophecies or revelations. And like I said episode, when we get to the episode on the transfiguration of Brigham Young, it's going to mirror this a lot. And I think that episode is going to be one of the most important to me that we do, because I think it is so important to understanding this whole concept of how these miracles, how these revelations and prophecies, how they can solidify in the community when you can trace back the lineage of those prophecies, and you can see that there's really nothing there, and yet they're accepted as absolute truth today by the church. So I think that's a really important way to kind of dissect some of these stories.
When I said that originally, that was back in spring of 2020 when I was doing that series for 9 weeks of issuing a podcast every business day for 9 weeks. That was early on in the COVID pandemic. So it was April, maybe May, at the latest of 2020. I am struck by the fact that I was wrong in that prediction that I gave, that you just quoted, because actually it hasn't been 10 years later. It's only 3 years later. It's now 2023. That record still exists, right? And yet we do have people claiming that it was prophecy of President Nelson that the COVID pandemic would hit. So I underestimated the facility of Latter-day Saints to create prophecy and insist on prophecy, even in contradiction to the record that still exists. And it only took them a couple of years and not a decade.
But they should all know, because you guys know the Church News has a podcast, right? The Church News, that outlet, has its own podcast. And Quinton L. Cook went on that podcast, and I'm just going to play this to you here right now, okay?
We didn't have revelation there's going to be a pandemic.
We didn't have revelation there was going to be a pandemic.
Oh, okay.
Say it.
Yeah.
So, the nail is in the coffin. Any member of the church that listens to the church outlet knows Quinton L. Cook has said it. Russell Nelson alluded to it. Quinton L. Cook has said it. They did not know this was coming.
And also just to end kind of this point, and then we'll get to the summary. It's such a powerful and effective claim. It's basically part of the core value proposition of Mormonism. It's like, we'll help you be with your family forever, and our leaders talk to God. Like, our leaders are prophets, seers, and revelators. Holy moly, if our leaders are able to translate languages that scholars can't translate, if they're able to see the future and prophesy what's going to happen about the future, that's awesome. I want that. I want to follow people that can do that, because that's magical. But it begs the question, and RFM, I think you were alluding to this, if there's one thing we can say about Mormon prophets, seers, and revelators between Joseph Smith and today, is they don't prophesy, they don't see, and they don't reveal. Because where is the new scripture? Where are the prophecies? And it would have been really handy if Russell M. Nelson had foreseen the COVID pandemic, and if he could have told everybody, told the United States to prepare the vaccines, or gotten all the masks and the respirators where they needed to be, and maybe he could have helped prevent hundreds of thousands, if not a million deaths, by actually producing a prophecy. But they don't prophesy, they don't see, they don't reveal, and that's one of, in my view, their biggest weaknesses. And it's a big problem, because they claim to do it, and then they don't do it, but then we create backdated prophecies that say they did do it, right?
Yeah.
All right. To make matters only worse, they hadn't mentioned anything about food storage in at least a decade.
Yeah, that's another one.
Actually made useful.
Yeah. Yep, and that was another one. Well said. I think Bednar, came on to give a speech. Is like, we've been telling you about food storage, and I think RFM might have been the one who did it. Someone did it. They looked back, and it was like I think it was over a decade since they mentioned it at General Conference in any meaningful way, and all of a sudden, the one time it might have been helpful, and there's no warning leading up to it. So
that was General Conference October of 2020, so the year of the pandemic. They didn't mention it in April General Conference, but Elder Bednar rushed into the breach in October to talk about food storage and how he does it, and his wife does it. They do it together, and they're just following what all the prophets have always said, and basically looking down his nose at everybody else who was sitting there without food storage because it
we've got some expired stuff in the basement, so
Yes. Hey, gentlemen, I've got to run here. I know you're at the end of the show.
Thank you so much for joining us, Arthur. We love you.
thank you very, very much for taking all the time. And
You guys are so welcome. I appreciate being invited. I'll take no more of the time as I make my exit off stage left. But thank you again. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you all.
thank you so much. Thanks for doing the podcast that this is based on. That was actually, you made me do 2 extra overviews because of that one podcast, so thank you for that.
Thank you. I'm honored. Talk to you later, guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay, and I'll just say to kind of close out this point, we should do an episode also on failed prophecies, just plain and simple failed prophecies. Whether that's that Jesus will come when Joseph Smith said he was going to come, that Independence, Missouri will be the gathering place, the New Jerusalem. All of a sudden, the church doesn't care about a gathering in the New Jerusalem anymore. We can talk about the law of consecration that gets repealed. We can talk about polygamy that gets repealed. We can talk about the Lamanites. Now all of a sudden we don't know who the Lamanites are. We could probably do a whole episode, Mike, on just failed prophecies in addition to backdated prophecies.
And I think our next episode is going to be on Joseph Smith's prophecies, and we're going to cover some of them in there because we're going to talk about. So I figured this way we get the backdated stuff out of the way, and then our next episode is going to have some of Joseph Smith's prophecies, where they might have come from, and obviously some of the ones that have failed that we kind of stopped talking about, and we can go over the apologetics responses on those as well. But yeah, we're going to cover those, so for sure we'll get to those.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and end by talking about why backdated prophecies matter.
Yeah, this is just one. We've talked about in a lot of these episodes that scholars can evaluate texts in so many different ways now to see if authors are leaving their fingerprints on the text that can allow them to date them or to identify who the actual author is. So with the book of Daniel, it's almost universally accepted that the actual writing dates much later than when it was claimed because, as we've talked about, prophecies go from incredibly specific to getting it wrong. And the same technique really is there for the Book of Mormon, which, to put it a different way, in the vision in verse 8:5, there are specific events covering from Columbus arriving in America in 1492 and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon in 1830. So that's a window of 338 years where we have specific events being revealed, such as Columbus's arrival, the white settlers taking the land from the Native Americans, the Revolutionary War, and the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith himself. And so that is a very concrete time frame with a lot of specificity. It's the same thing we see in the Book of Daniel. Yet after those specific prophecies, we get nothing after Joseph Smith's lifetime. And so, as we talked about, I'm not saying the Book of Mormon should speak about how in the future people will use the internet to fact check the Book of Mormon's claims, or that we're going to be flying airplanes across the skies. But there's no mention of the Civil War. There's no mention of the fight about slavery in the United States. There's nothing about, as we'll get to in our final slide, there's nothing of the unique elements of Mormonism that we all know today outside of infant baptism that are in the Book of Mormon. All of that stuff comes after it. So it allows us to basically date when the Book of Mormon is written because we can see what's in there, we can see what's not in there, and that puts it in a very specific time frame. And I think that's why this is a very important tool for scholars, not just for the Bible, the Book of Mormon, for any text that purports to be ancient or long before the kind of general consensus of when we know it came to be.
Excellent. All right, Mike, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which is the Joseph Smith lesson, not just fingerprints all over the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, so just like, in addition to working to backdate prophecies in the Book of Mormon, as we mentioned in this episode, his errors in biblical scholarship can let us know with absolute certainty that the Book of Mormon is not an ancient record, but is going to be a 19th century text produced by Joseph Smith because a lot of the biblical scholarship errors are things that just were not known in the 19th century. And obviously, you can make the argument that they're from hundreds of years ago, but if they're from ancient, uncorrupted texts, obviously they're not going to have these kinds of errors, such as like Deutero-Isaiah and not knowing, like kind of the early stories of Genesis are more mythical. And so, as we mentioned in this episode, even when Joseph does punt the revelations of the Book of Mormon to the Book of Revelation in the New Testament, he just doesn't understand that the author John of the Book of Revelation is not the same as the Gospel of John, because at the time everyone thought that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whereas today we know they're anonymous authors. And the simple truth is this: if you gave the Book of Mormon to a scholar without any information about when it was written, who it was produced by, or the story of the gold plates, a scholar could identify the Book of Mormon to the 19th century without using any outside sources, because of the fact it does include very specific prophecies that take you right to the 19th century. And again, it's the exact same method that scholars use to date, different books of the Bible, such as the Book of Daniel. And there's just no way to get around it for the Book of Mormon unless you invoke special pleading to say that the Book of Mormon can't be viewed with the same literary tools that you would really apply to any other text, religious or non-religious. And so the fact that Joseph Smith leaves so many fingerprints on this text allows us to know with absolute certainty that it is not going to be an ancient, authentic text.
All right, Nemo, any reaction to that slide?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a member of the church who kind of subscribes to biblical scholarship, and you're one of these people that takes it very seriously and looks into the authorship of the Bible and all that sort of stuff, then you have to accept that the same standards that have been applied to the Book of Daniel, for example, when applied to the Book of Mormon, reveal it to be a 19th century text. So, yeah, unless you're willing to let your ideology overtake kind of the presentation of the facts, then that's the conclusion you end up coming to based on that.
All right. Well, I think that gives us a good capstone for the episode, but we have one more slide.
Oh, yeah, really?
No, it's good. Which is that the Book of Mormon is unaware of any doctrines past 1829. All the Nauvoo innovations, as I like to call them. Do you want to finish out this slide, Mike?
Yeah, this is just kind of like, in a lot of ways, sometimes one of the easiest kind of methods to looking at a problem is almost to like reverse it. So this whole episode we've been looking at revelations and prophecies that are backdated into the Book of Mormon or into the Bible, or even into Joseph Smith's Revelations. But if you look at it from the flip side, we are told as members that the Book of Mormon brings us the fullness of the gospel. And I think Nemo mentioned it earlier, this is supposed to be the restoration of all the things that were lost by the early church, right? And yet the Book of Mormon is not aware of almost every one of the uniquely Mormon teachings that are going to come after 1829, such as a temple marriage being a requirement for exaltation, baptism for the dead, celestial marriage lasting for a time in all eternity, that salvation in the highest kingdom requires going through an endowment ceremony. And whereas in the Book of Mormon, not only is there no mention of exaltation or an endowment ceremony, but the idea of a secret combination requiring secret oaths are condemned. And that really stems back into the whole masonry and the temple episode we did. They do mention that Melchizedek was a priest, but they don't mention the idea that you can hold two different priesthoods. And we talked about that in our priesthood restoration episode. They don't mention that the sacrament should include water. There's no mention of the word of wisdom. There's no mention that prophets are promoted to the office by church leaders instead of by God. They don't mention, and this one seems like an important one, that the Garden of Eden was in Missouri, and that Adam and Eve, the first people on Earth, lived in Missouri. And then, the idea of the presidency is anachronistic because obviously there's no president in the ancient church. And the Book of Mormon mentions nothing beyond 12 disciples, so the whole idea of like the 70s and all that, none of that. And so, and there's more than this. And so it just tells you that the Book of Mormon is very much a production of its time frame. And so Joseph Smith is able to backdate everything that happens up to his lifetime. But all of these things that he's going to evolve to and create this theology just are absent. And you have to ask yourself why a book that proclaims the fullness of the gospel lacks all of these very uniquely important Mormon doctrines when, Joseph Smith hadn't created them yet. And so that to me is one of the easiest ways to kind of date the Book of Mormon and to kind of see how he's able to backdate everything he knows up until 1829, but can't backdate all of these later innovations he's going to come up with after. And for some reason, to me, that feels like the best way to conclude this episode is almost take a look from the other side and say, okay, instead of looking at what's backdated, what isn't in there that should be? I think John alluded to that earlier, and this is a lot of very important stuff that should be there if this is a restoration of ancient practices.
Brilliant.